I watched the rain streak down the windows of the home I built with my own two hands. But for the first time in 36 years, the glass felt like a barrier between me and my own life. I was standing in the kitchen, Marianne's kitchen, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, listening to my son-in-law, Connor, laugh in the living room. It was a sharp, jagged sound that didn't belong in a house that used to be filled with the soft hum of my wife singing. "Theodore, you still standing there like a statue?" Connor shouted from the couch, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "The game's starting. Why don't you make yourself useful and grab me a beer since you're already in the kitchen?" I didn't answer, I just looked at the grain of the oak cabinets. I'd installed those in the summer of '88. I remembered the sweat on my brow and the way Marianne had brought me lemonade, telling me that one day we'd grow old together in this very spot. She was half right. I was old, and I was in this spot, but she was gone, and in her place was a man who treated me like a ghost in my own hallways. I didn't know it then, but in exactly 48 hours, my life was going to explode. Not with a whimper, but with the kind of calculated cruelty that changes a man's DNA. My name is Theodore Marsh. I'm 72 years old, and for 38 of those years, I was a highway engineer for the Oregon Department of Transportation. I spent my life thinking about foundations. If the footings are deep enough and the concrete is poured right, a bridge can withstand almost anything. Raging rivers, tectonic shifts, the weight of 1,000 semi-trucks. I applied that logic to my life. I built a solid marriage, a solid home on Ponderosa Lane in Bend, and what I thought was a solid relationship with my daughter Claire. But people aren't like concrete. People are porous. They shift. They erode. When Marianne died in 2016 from pancreatic cancer, the foundation of my world didn't just crack, it vanished. The house became an echo chamber. I'd walk into the bedroom and expect to see her reading under the lamp, but there was only the cold indentation of a pillow. The silence was so heavy I could feel it in my joints. So, when Claire called me 6 months later, crying because Connor had been laid off from his sales job in Portland and they were facing eviction, I didn't hesitate. I was an engineer. I saw a problem, and I provided a structural solution. "Come home, honey," I told her. "Move into the guest wing. It'll give you guys a chance to save up, get back on your feet. It'll only be for a few months." A few months turned into 8 years. It's funny how a person can lose their home without ever leaving it. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow, rhythmic chipping away of your boundaries. At first, it was nice. Claire cooked dinner, and Connor helped me clear some brush in the backyard. But then, the help started to feel like an occupation. Connor decided the garage was too cluttered with my engineering archives and helped by moving 30 years of my life into a leaky shed in the backyard. Then he decided the living room furniture was depressing and replaced Marianne's favorite velvet armchair with a sleek, gray sectional that made my back ache. By year 5, I stopped being the head of the household and became the roommate who forgot to die. Connor is a man who exudes a specific kind of toxic confidence. He's tall, with hair that's always a little too perfectly gelled, and a smile that never quite reaches his eyes. He's the kind of guy who talks about hustle and passive income while sitting on my sofa, drinking my expensive scotch and using my Wi-Fi to look for jobs he has no intention of taking. "Theodore," he said to me one evening about 6 months ago, leaning against the kitchen island, "you ever think about the future? I mean, this house is a lot of maintenance for a guy your age. All those stairs. The yard work. Claire and I were talking. Maybe it's time we look at some luxury senior living options. You know, places where you don't have to worry about a thing." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I like my stairs, Connor, and I like my yard." He just chuckled, that condescending little sound that made my skin crawl. Sure, but wouldn't it be nice to be around people your own speed, instead of just hovering around here?" I looked at Claire, hoping for a defense, but she just looked at her plate. She'd changed too. The vibrant, curious girl I'd raised had been replaced by someone who walked on eggshells, constantly gauging Connor's mood. She loved him, or she was afraid of losing him, and that love had turned her into a stranger to me. That brings us to the first Tuesday in April. I was at the local quick stop on Highway 97, getting gas for my old Ford F-150. My neighbor and oldest friend, Bernard, was with me. Bernard is a retired postal worker with a mouth like a sailor and a heart of gold. He'd watched the situation at my house with growing disgust for years. "Theo, you look like a man who's been sleeping in a coffin," Bernard barked, leaning against the counter as I waited for my receipt. "Just tired, Bernie." "It's been a long week," I sighed. It's been a long 8 years, he countered. He pointed at the glowing Powerball sign behind the clerk. The jackpot was at $95 million. Tell you what, buy a ticket. If you win, you can buy a private island and leave that leech Connor to rot in the desert. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in days. I don't play the lottery, Bernie. It's a tax on people who are bad at math. It's $2 for a dream, you old cynic. Buy one. Better yet, buy two. I'll even give you the $4. I waved him off, pulling out my own wallet. Keep your money. If it'll make you stop nagging me, I'll buy them. I looked at the clerk, a guy named Dave who'd seen me every Tuesday for a decade. Give me 2 Powerball tickets, Dave. Quick picks. Dave swiped my card, the machine beeped, and he handed me 2 slips of thermal paper. I tucked one into my wallet and, for some reason I still can't explain, I put the other one in my shirt pocket. When I got home that evening, the air in the house was thick. Connor and Claire were arguing in the bedroom something about a credit card bill. I walked into the kitchen to put the groceries away, feeling the weight of the house on my shoulders. Claire came out a few minutes later, her eyes red. She started reaching for the kettle, her hands shaking slightly. My heart broke for her. Despite everything, she was still my little girl. I wanted to give her something, anything to make her smile. Here, honey, I said, reaching into my shirt pocket and pulling out the ticket. I bought this for you at the gas station today. Bernard's idea. Maybe we'll get lucky. She took it with a weak smile. Thanks, Dad, that's sweet. Connor walked into the room then, his eyes immediately zeroing in on the slip of paper in her hand. What's that? A lottery ticket, really, Theodore? That's your big contribution to the family finances this month? A piece of paper with a 1 in 300 million chance of being worth the ink it's printed on? It's just a gesture, Connor, I said, my voice tight. He snatched the ticket from Claire's hand, squinting at it. Powerball. 95 million. Well, I guess even a broken clock is right twice a day, though in your case it's more like once a century. He tossed the ticket onto the kitchen counter like it was trash. I didn't tell them about the second ticket in my wallet. In my mind, it wasn't a secret, it was just irrelevant. I went to bed that night thinking about the foundation of the bridge I'd worked on in '94, wondering if the pylons were still holding up against the current. 3 nights later, the world shifted. I was in my workshop in the garage working on a small cedar jewelry box. It's the only place I feel like Theodore Marsh again. Then, I heard it. A scream from inside the house. I dropped my chisel and ran toward the kitchen. I expected a fire or a fall. Instead, I found Claire standing in the middle of the room, clutching her phone, her face as white as a sheet. Connor was hovering over her, his eyes wide and wild, a look of pure, unadulterated greed on his face that I will never forget. We won, Claire whispered, her voice cracking. Dad. The ticket you gave me. We won. Connor grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her not out of affection but out of a manic, desperate energy. $95 million. Claire, do you understand? We're rich. I'm rich. I stood in the doorway, a strange coldness washing over me. That's wonderful news, honey, I said, trying to find my footing. Connor turned to look at me. The mask he'd worn for 8 years, the mask of the slightly annoying but ultimately harmless son-in-law, didn't just slip. It disintegrated. He looked at me not as a father-in-law or a benefactor, but as an obstacle. Yeah, Theodore, Connor said, his voice suddenly dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. It is wonderful news. In fact, it's life-changing. He walked over to the kitchen table, picked up his laptop, and closed it with a sharp snap. Then he looked me dead in the eye, which is why we need to talk about your new living arrangements. Because, as of right now, this house, it's not big enough for all 3 of us, and since we're the ones with $95 million, I think it's time you packed your bags. My heart stopped. Connor, what are you talking about? This is my house. I built this house. Connor stepped toward me, invading my personal space, his breath smelling of the expensive scotch he'd stolen from my cabinet. He smiled, and it was the most hideous thing I'd ever seen. Not anymore, old man. I've already looked at the deed. You might have built it, but you're 72. You're confused. You're forgetful. A few legal filings, a couple of concerns about your mental state, and with the kind of lawyers I'm about to hire, this house will be ours by the end of the month. You're going to a home, Theodore, and you're going there tonight. I looked at Claire. Claire? You can't be serious. She wouldn't look at me. She was staring at the winning ticket in her hand, her thumb stroking the paper as if it were a religious relic. I'm sorry, Dad, she whispered, but Connor's right. We need a fresh start. We need Space. Space. After 8 years of giving them a roof, food, and every penny of my patience, they were throwing me out like a bag of old clothes, because they finally had the means to be as cruel as they'd always wanted to be. I felt a surge of heat in my chest, a fire I hadn't felt since I was a young man defending my first project site. I reached into my back pocket and felt the leather of my wallet. I felt the crisp edge of the second ticket I'd bought. I looked at Connor, who was already reaching for my car keys on the hook by the door. "I'll go," I said, my voice eerily steady. "But before I do, Connor, I have one question for you." He rolled his eyes. "Make it quick. I have a penthouse to scout." "Do you know?" I asked, a slow smile spreading across my face. "The difference between a gift and an investment?" Connor's brow furrowed. "What the hell does that matter?" "It matters," I said, "because you think you just won the lottery. But you didn't realize that when I went to that gas station, I didn't just buy one ticket for Claire." I pulled my wallet out and held it up. Connor's face went from smug to confused, and then, as the realization began to dawn on him, the color started to drain from his cheeks until he looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. "What did you do, Theodore?" he hissed. I didn't answer. Not yet. I just looked at the clock on the wall. The game was only just beginning. The silence in the kitchen was so thick you could have cut it with a framing saw. Connor's face was a study in oscillating terror, his eyes darting from my weathered leather wallet to the small, white slip of paper tucked inside the clear plastic window. He knew. He didn't know exactly what it meant yet, but his predatory instincts were screaming that his $95 million payday had just hit a massive structural snag. "You're lying," Connor spat, though his voice lacked the oily confidence it had just seconds ago. "You're an old man with a grudge. You probably bought a ticket for a different draw. You're just trying to scare us." I didn't blink. I've stared down city councils and state auditors. A 34-year-old bully in a designer hoodie wasn't going to make me flinch. "I don't play games, Connor. I build bridges. And the first rule of building is that you never rely on a single point of failure." I looked at Claire. She was shaking, her eyes wide, looking at me like I was a stranger. Maybe I was. I'd spent 8 years being the quiet, grieving father, the man who let them eat his food and occupy his space because I was too tired to fight the loneliness. But that man had walked out the door the moment Connor threatened to put me in a cage. "Get out," Connor growled, stepping toward me again, his hands curling into fists. "I don't care what's in your wallet. This house is a health hazard for a senile old man. If you're not gone by tomorrow morning, I'm calling the authorities. I'll tell them you're delusional. I'll tell them you threatened Claire. Who do you think they're going to believe? The multimillionaire couple or the guy who talks to his dead wife in the garden?" The cruelty of that last line felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of an outburst. I simply turned, walked to the mudroom, grabbed my heavy canvas jacket, and stepped out into the biting Central Oregon night. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the last time I would ever feel like a victim in my own home. I drove to Bernard's place, my hands steady on the wheel of the Ford, even as my heart felt like it was trying to kick its way out of my chest. Bernard lived 3 houses down in a ranch-style place that Marianne used to say smelled like cedar and old paper. When he opened the door, he didn't even ask what was wrong. He just saw my face, grabbed a bottle of bourbon, and pointed to the kitchen table. "He did it, didn't he?" Bernard said, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. The bastard finally showed his teeth. I told him everything. The scream of joy that turned into a scream of eviction. The threat of the senior home. The way Claire had sat there, silent as a grave, while her husband planned to discard her father like a piece of scrap lumber. And then I pulled the second ticket out of my wallet. Bernard squinted through his bifocals at the numbers. Then he looked at the screen of his tablet, where the winning Powerball numbers were still plastered in bright yellow font. His jaw dropped so low I thought it might hit the linoleum. "Theodore, you didn't just buy a second ticket?" Bernard whispered, his voice trembling. "You bought the exact same numbers." "I did," I said, taking a slow sip of the bourbon. I remembered the sequence I'd picked for the first one. I figured, if there's a 1,000,000,000 chance these numbers come up, I want to make sure I'm holding the winning hand too. "Do you realize what this does?" Bernard hooted, a wild, jagged laugh escaping him. "The jackpot is 95 million. If you have a winning ticket and they have a winning ticket, the prize is split. You just took $47.5 million right out of his greedy mouth." I looked out the window toward my house. The lights were all on. I could see Connor's shadow pacing back and forth in the living room window. "It's not about the money, Bernie. It was never about the money. It's about the foundation. He thinks he can bulldoze my life because he's got a bigger bank account. He doesn't realize I'm the one who poured the concrete. As I sat there in Bernard's kitchen, the memories of the last 8 years began to play back like a grainy, painful film loop. I realized then that the early warning signs hadn't been signs at all. They'd been a deliberate, slow-motion demolition of my autonomy. It had started with the small things, the gaslighting as the kids call it. 3 years ago, I'd lost my spare set of truck keys. I was sure I'd left them on the peg by the door. I'd searched for 3 days, getting more and more frustrated. "Dad, maybe you're just getting a little foggy," Connor had said, leaning against the doorframe with that mock sympathetic look. "You probably dropped them in the yard. It happens at your age. Don't worry, I'll drive you to the hardware store." I'd felt a cold shiver of doubt then. Was I losing it? Was the fog finally rolling in? It wasn't until 6 months later, when I was cleaning out the gutters, that I found those keys tucked deep inside a bag of potting soil in the back of the shed, a place I hadn't touched in a year. I'd assumed I'd been clumsy. Now, staring at the bourbon in my glass, I realized Connor had put them there. He'd been planting the seeds of my senility for years, waiting for the right moment to harvest them. Then there was the thermostat war. Marianne and I always kept the house at 68. It was our sweet spot. But after Connor moved in, I'd wake up in the middle of the night shivering, the house plummeting to 55. When I'd check the dial, it was always turned down. "Theodore, you're just getting thin-blooded," Connor would say the next morning, pouring himself a bowl of my expensive granola. "The heat was on all night. Maybe you should see a doctor about your circulation. I'm worried about you, man." He'd said it in front of Claire. He'd said it so often and so convincingly that she started looking at me with pity. That pity was the sharpest knife of all. It was the tool he used to isolate her from me. He convinced her that I was a burden, a ticking time bomb of dementia that only he had the strength to manage. He'd turned my own daughter into my jailer, and she didn't even know she was holding the keys. "What are you going to do?" Bernard asked, snapping me back to the present. "You can't go back there tonight. He's wound up tighter than a cheap watch." "I'm going to stay here, if you'll have me," I said. "And tomorrow, I'm going to see a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I need someone who knows how to handle a snake." "I know just the person," Bernard said. "My niece, Rachel. She's a pit bull in a power suit, does estate law in Portland, but she's in town visiting. She hates guys like Connor, thinks they're a blight on the species." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm. The engineer in me was already calculating the loads, checking the stress points. Connor thought he was playing a game of checkers, but I was still building the bridge. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the house. I thought about the time Claire was 6 and she'd help me paint the baseboards with a bucket of water and a dry brush, her face full of serious concentration. I thought about the way Marianne had looked at her, so full of pride. That house was a vessel for our history. To Connor, it was just equity. To me, it was my soul. The next morning, the sun rose over the Cascades, a brutal, brilliant orange that set the snow on the peaks on fire. I met Rachel at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. She was sharp, with eyes that seemed to scan you for weaknesses like an X-ray technician. I laid it all out. The tickets, the 8 years of subtle abuse, the threat from the night before. I showed her the second ticket and the receipt I'd kept from Dave at the quick stop. Rachel didn't smile, but her eyes sparked with a cold, professional hunger. "Theodore," she said, tapping her pen on the table. "Connor thinks he's holding a winning ticket. What he doesn't realize is that he's holding a liability. In the state of Oregon, if there are 2 winning tickets for the same draw, the prize is split. But there's something else. Something he's going to regret very dearly." "What's that?" I asked. "The receipt," she said, pointing to the crumpled slip of paper. "You paid for both tickets with your debit card. You have proof of purchase. You gave one as a gift, but you never signed over the rights to the jackpot. More importantly, he just threatened to commit elder abuse and illegal eviction in front of a witness himself, essentially, if we can get him to admit it. But there's a twist, Theodore. A big one." She leaned in, her voice dropping. "Connor didn't just lose his job 8 years ago. I did a little digging last night after Bernard called me. Connor has a history in Portland. A history of something called predatory marriage schemes. He targets families with assets. He's a professional, Theodore. And he's been waiting for a windfall like this to finally dump you and take the pot." My stomach turned. I thought of my daughter, trapped in the clutches of a man who saw her as a paycheck. "I have a plan," Rachel said. "But you have to go back. You have to let him think he's winning. You have to be the senile old man for just a few more days." I need him to put his threats in writing. I need him to try and file those papers to have you declared incompetent." "Why would I want him to do that?" I asked, horrified. "Because," Rachel smiled, and it was a terrifying sight. "The moment he files those papers, he's committing perjury and fraud. And I'm going to make sure that when the dust settles, he doesn't just lose the 95 million. He loses his freedom." I drove back to Ponderosa Lane at noon. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw Connor standing on the porch, holding a stack of legal-looking documents. He looked triumphant. He looked like he'd already spent the money in his head. "Glad you're back, Pops," he called out, his voice dripping with fake concern. "I spent the morning talking to some experts. We've got the paperwork ready. It's a voluntary transfer of the deed and a power of attorney. You sign these, and we'll make sure you get the best room at the Shady Pines facility. You don't sign, and well, let's just say the police are on standby for a wellness check that won't go your way." I walked up the stairs, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I looked at the papers. "And Claire? Does she agree with this?" "Claire's doing what's best for the family," Connor said, stepping aside to let me into the house. I walked into the living room and saw her sitting on the sofa, her face hidden in her hands. The house felt cold. The foundation was groaning under the weight of his lies. I took the pen he offered me, my hand trembling, not because I was old, but because I was suppressed fury made flesh. I looked at the line where I was supposed to sign away my life. "I'll sign," I whispered, "but only if you promise me one thing, Connor." "Anything, Theodore," he sneered. "What is it?" "I want to see the winning ticket one more time," I said. "I want to see the thing that's worth more than your soul." Connor laughed and pulled the ticket from his pocket, waving it in front of my face like a carrot. He didn't see me reach into my own pocket. He didn't see the tiny, high-definition recording device Bernard had given me, clipped to the underside of my lapel. "Sign the damn papers, Theodore," Connor snapped, "or I start telling the neighbors how you've been touching things you shouldn't. I'll ruin you before I kick you out." I didn't know then that the man I'd let sleep under my roof was already sharpening the knife for my back, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the one who was going to be ruined. Just as my pen touched the paper, the front door flew open. It wasn't the police. It was Dave, the clerk from the Quick Stop, looking out of breath and holding a printout from his security camera. "Theodore," Dave shouted, his eyes darting between me and Connor. "You need to see this. There's something wrong with the transaction from Tuesday." Connor's face went from triumph to a mask of pure, murderous rage and a heartbeat. "Get the hell out of here, Dave. This is a family matter." "It's not just a family matter," Dave said, stepping into the foyer. "It's a felony." Connor didn't move. He stood there, frozen like a deer in the high beams of a semi-truck, the stack of transfer papers still clutched in his hand. Dave, the clerk from the Quick Stop, was breathing hard, his flannel shirt damp with the evening mist. He held a manila envelope like it was a shield. "What are you talking about, Dave?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My mind was racing, trying to calculate the variables. "This guy," Dave said, pointing a trembling finger at Connor. "He came back to the shop about an hour after you left on Tuesday, Theodore. He thought I didn't recognize him. He tried to offer me $5,000 in cash to adjust the digital record of the sale. He wanted me to go into the system and change the timestamp so it looked like he was the one who swiped the card, or at the very least to delete the security footage of the transaction entirely." The air in the room turned arctic. I looked at Connor. The predatory mask was back on, but it was cracking. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "You're crazy, Dave," Connor snarled, taking a step toward the clerk. "You're an alcoholic looking for a payday. Get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." "Your house?" Dave laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "Theodore's name is on the deed, kid. And as for being an alcoholic, maybe, but I'm an alcoholic with a cloud sync security system. You didn't realize that when you were leaning over my counter offering me a bribe. You were being recorded in 4K with audio." Dave pulled a flash drive out of the envelope and held it up. "I saw the news about the jackpot. I put two and two together. I knew what kind of man you were the second you walked in with that hustle in your eyes." I looked at my daughter. Claire was finally looking up from her hands. Her face wasn't just pale anymore, it was haunted. "Connor, is that true? Did you go back there?" "I was protecting us, Claire." Connor exploded, spinning around to face her. "I knew your dad would try to pull something. I knew he'd try to take it all for himself. I was just securing our future." That's when the foundation really started to groan. I realized then that the man I'd let live in my house for 8 years wasn't just a parasite, he was a demolition expert. He hadn't been waiting for a lucky break, he'd been actively trying to engineer my downfall since the day he moved in. As I stood there, watching Connor scramble to lie his way out of a felony bribe, my mind drifted back to 2017. It was the first year they lived with me. I wanted to believe I was being a good father. I wanted to believe that by opening my doors, I was honoring Marianne's memory. But looking back, the red flags were waving like a parade. I remembered the incident with the garden. Marianne had spent 20 years cultivating a small patch of heirloom roses along the south fence. They were her pride and joy. After she passed, I spent every morning out there, talking to them, keeping them alive because they felt like the last living piece of her soul. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of a chainsaw. I ran outside to find Connor, grinning like a fool, standing over the mangled remains of the rose bushes. "Surprise, Theodore," he'd shouted over the roar of the engine. "I figured we could put in a nice low-maintenance gravel pit here. Maybe a fire feature. Those roses were a mess covered in thorns and taking up way too much water. You're welcome." I'd collapsed onto the porch steps, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. Claire had come out a moment later, looking horrified, but Connor had wrapped an arm around her waist and whispered something in her ear. "Dad," she'd said, her voice small and rehearsed. "Connor's just trying to modernize the place. It's better this way. Less for you to worry about." That was the moment I should have seen it. He wasn't modernizing. He was erasing. Every time he moved a piece of furniture, every time he lost one of my tools, every time he suggested I was confused about a bill, it was all part of the same blueprint. He was slowly, methodically stripping away the things that made this house mine until I was nothing more than an unwanted guest in a structure I'd built. But the worst part wasn't the roses or the thermostat. It was what he did to Claire. My daughter was a brilliant girl, a nurse with a heart that could encompass the world, but Connor knew how to play on her insecurities. He'd convinced her that the reason he couldn't keep a job wasn't because he was lazy or arrogant, but because the world was out to get him. He made himself the victim, and he made her the only person who could save him. "Your father doesn't understand the pressure I'm under," I'd overheard him saying through the thin walls of the guest wing. "He's got his pension, his paid-off house, his easy life. He looks down on us, Claire. He looks down on you for marrying me. He thinks you could have done better." "That's not true, Connor," she'd sobbed. "Dad loves us." "Does he? Or does he just love having people to control? He's a bridge builder, Claire. Everything has to be his way or the highway. One of these days, he's going to get bored of us and kick us to the curb. We need to be ready for that." He'd spent years whispering those poisons into her ear until she started to view my every act of kindness as a calculated move for control. If I bought groceries, I was flaunting my wealth. If I asked about their job search, I was judging their failure. By the time that lottery ticket hit the counter, the wedge between me and my daughter was a mile wide. Connor hadn't just built a wall, he'd built a fortress. Back in the kitchen, the tension snapped. Connor lunged for the flash drive in Dave's hand, but I stepped in the way. I'm 72, but I spent 40 years hauling survey equipment through the Oregon bush. I'm made of old growth and iron. I caught Connor by the wrist, and for a second, I saw the coward behind the bully. His eyes darted around, looking for an exit. "Get out of my house, Connor," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a power I didn't know I still had. "Take your papers, take your lies, and get out." "You can't kick me out," Connor screamed, his voice turning shrill. "Claire is on the lease. Well, there is no lease, but she's a resident. You have to give us 30 days, and we have the ticket. $95 million, Theodore. You're nothing but a bitter old man who's about to be sued into the Stone Age." He turned to Claire, desperate now. "Claire, call the lawyer. Call the guy I told you about. Tell him your father is assaulting me. Tell him he's had a breakdown." Claire didn't move. She was looking at the flash drive in Dave's hand, then back at the man she'd spent a decade of her life with. "Did you really try to bribe him, Connor, with money we don't even have yet?" "I was doing it for you," he cried. "No," she whispered, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "You were doing it for the money. You were doing it so you didn't have to share it with the man who gave it to us." Connor's face contorted into something monstrous. "You're gonna take his side? After everything? Fine. Keep your pathetic father. But I'm taking the ticket. It's in my name now. I signed the back of it while you were in the shower, Claire. Legally, it's mine, all of it." The room went dead silent. Claire gasped. "You did what?" "That was my gift. My father gave that to me." "A gift with no paperwork is just a piece of paper," Connor sneered, backing toward the door. And since I'm the one who validated it, I'm the one the state is going to pay. Enjoy your drafty old house, Theodore. I'm moving to Vegas. And Claire, if you want a cent of this money, you'd better start packing your bags and acting like a loyal wife. He turned and bolted out the door, the tires of his SUV screeching as he tore down Ponderosa Lane. Dave looked at me, his face full of pity. Theodore, I'm so sorry. I didn't think he'd go that far. It's okay, Dave, I said, though my legs felt like they were made of water. Thank you for coming. You have no idea how much you've helped. Once Dave left, I turned to Claire. She was slumped in a kitchen chair, her head in her hands, shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her like I did when she was 6 and fell off her bike. But the 8 years of silence felt like a canyon between us. Claire, I said softly. I'm so sorry, Dad. She choked out. I was so blind. I thought he loved me. I thought he was just stressed. I didn't know he was. That, I know, honey. He's a builder of a different kind. He builds traps. I walked over to the counter and picked up the second ticket, the one I'd kept in my wallet, the one with the identical numbers. He thinks he's going to claim the whole 95 million, I said. He thinks he's won. But he doesn't realize that in the eyes of the law, he's only half right. And half of 95 million is still a lot of money. But it's not enough to buy your way out of what I'm going to do next. I didn't know it yet, but Connor hadn't just signed the back of that ticket. He'd signed his own confession. Because while he was busy trying to bribe gas station clerks, I had been busy doing something else. I hadn't just bought a second ticket. I had called Bernard's niece, Rachel, and we had spent the afternoon setting a trap of our own. Claire, I said, crouching down so I was at eye level with her. I need you to listen to me very carefully. If we're going to fix this, you have to be the one to do it. You have to go to him. You have to pretend you're on his side. She looked at me, horrified. What? No. I never want to see him again. You have to, I said, my voice like steel. Because I just realized something. Connor didn't just sign that ticket tonight. I looked at the security footage Dave brought. Connor didn't go back to the gas station just to bribe Dave. He went back to do something else. Something that's going to make sure he never sees a dime of that money. I leaned in, my heart pounding. He stole your identity, Claire, and I have the proof. What happened next changed everything. Because as I was explaining the plan to my daughter, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from an unknown number. I opened it, and my blood turned to ice. It was a photo of the back of the winning ticket, but it wasn't Connor's signature on the line. It was mine. Someone had forged my name on the winning ticket, and I knew exactly who had the skill to mimic my handwriting perfectly. I looked at Claire, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of genuine fear, because the person who had forged my signature wasn't Connor, it was my daughter. The image on my phone screen felt like a jagged piece of glass pressing into my palm. I stared at the back of that lottery ticket, the one that was supposed to be our salvation, and there it was, my name, Theodore Marsh. The elegant, slightly slanting M, and the sharp cross on the T that I'd practiced for 50 years on thousands of engineering blueprints. But I hadn't signed it. I looked up at Claire. She was still sitting at the kitchen table, her shoulders hunched, looking small and broken. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of a structure about to collapse. Claire, I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy boot. Look at me. She slowly raised her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. I turned the phone screen toward her. I didn't say a word. I just waited. She let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He was going to kill me, Dad. Not with his hands, but he was going to take everything. He told me if I didn't sign it over to him, he'd leave me with nothing. He said he'd tell the police I'd been stealing from your pension for years. He's been keeping records of every time I used your card for groceries, every time I paid a bill. He called it financial elder abuse. He told me he'd put me in prison, and you in a home. I felt a cold, sharp anger slice through my chest. So you signed my name? I couldn't sign mine, she whispered, the words tumbling out now. If I signed my name, he'd have forced me to go to the lottery office right then. He'd have taken the money and I'd never have seen him again. But I knew if I signed your name, the signature wouldn't match. I knew if he tried to claim it, the state would flag it. I was trying to poison the ticket, Dad. I was trying to build a bridge that wouldn't hold his weight. It was a desperate, messy plan. A plan born of fear and years of being eroded by a master manipulator. My daughter hadn't betrayed me to get the money. She'd forged my name to stop Connor from taking it. But in doing so, she'd handed him the ultimate weapon. "I didn't know he took a photo of it," she said, looking at the phone. "He must have sent that to you to show you he has proof that you already signed over your rights to the winnings." I realized then what Connor was doing. He wasn't just trying to steal the lottery money. He was trying to link the forged signature to the transfer of deed papers he wanted me to sign for the house. If he could prove I signed the ticket, he could argue I was also fully aware when I signed the house over to him. He was setting up a narrative where I was a willing participant in my own destruction. Before I could respond, the sound of a high-performance engine roared in the driveway. Headlights swept across the kitchen walls like searchlights in a prison yard. Connor was back, and he wasn't alone. The front door didn't just open, it hit the wall with a violence that made the house shudder. Connor walked in, followed by a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit carrying a briefcase. Connor looked different. The panic from an hour ago was gone, replaced by a terrifying, glassy-eyed arrogance. He'd had a drink, maybe 3, and he'd found his reinforcements. "Theodore," he shouted, throwing his arms out wide as if he were welcoming me to my own funeral. "I hope you've had time to reflect on your confused behavior. This is Mr. Sterling. He's a specialist in estate transitions, and he's here to witness the finalization of our agreement." I stood my ground, my hands behind my back, hiding the tremor that was starting to take hold of my fingers. "There is no agreement, Connor. Get out." Connor laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. He walked over to the kitchen island and slammed a folder down. "Actually, there is. I've been talking to some friends in Portland. We know all about your little engineering pension. We know about the irregularities and how this house was zoned. And now," he leaned in, his eyes bright with malice, "I have a photo of a winning lottery ticket with your signature on it. A signature that says you gave the rights to those winnings to your daughter and her husband." He tapped the folder. "The law doesn't care if you don't remember signing it, Theodore. The law cares about the ink on the paper. And if you want to play the senile card to get out of it, fine. But that only proves my point. You aren't fit to live here. You're a danger to yourself and your assets." He looked at the man in the suit. "Sterling, show him the notice." The man stepped forward, avoiding my eyes. He handed me a single sheet of paper. It was an emergency petition for temporary guardianship. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice like iron. Connor's face contorted. He grabbed a kitchen chair, the one I'd carved a new leg for last summer, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the oak cabinets. Claire screamed and retreated into the corner. "You will sign!" Connor roared. "You've lived in this house for 36 years. It's over. The world belongs to people who know how to take what they want. You're an antique, Theodore. You're a relic. After 8 years of sleeping in your guest room and listening to your pathetic stories about Bridges and Marianne, I've earned this. I've earned every square inch of this property." He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "Get out of this house, Theodore, right now. I've already called the locksmith. I've already called the moving van for your belongings, which, by the way, are mostly going to the dump. This house belongs to the winner of the $95 million jackpot." He smiled then, a slow, sickening grin. "I'm not just taking the money, Theo. I'm taking the foundation. I'm taking everything you ever built. Now, get your coat and get out. Before I have Sterling here, call the police and report a violent domestic disturbance by a mentally unstable senior." I looked at Claire. She was shaking, her eyes darting between me and her husband. This was it. Rock bottom. My son-in-law was physically throwing me out of the home I'd built with my wife, using a forged signature and a fake guardianship petition as a crowbar. I felt the weight of the second ticket in my pocket. I felt the recording device on my lapel. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just looked at Connor and, for the first time in years, I felt a strange, cold peace. It was the feeling an engineer gets when they realize a bridge is unsalvageable, when they know the only way to save the crossing is to trigger the demolition and start over from the bedrock. "I'll go," I said softly. "Dad, no!" Claire cried out. "It's okay, Claire," I said, looking at her with all the love I had left. "Let him have the house. Let him have the ticket. Foundations are important, honey, but you can't build a life on sand." Connor sneered and stepped back, gesturing toward the door. Music to my ears. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out, Pops. Oh, and don't bother going to Bernard's. I've already told the neighbors we're dealing with a psychotic break. If anyone helps you, they're looking at a lawsuit for interfering with a legal guardianship." I walked to the door. I grabbed my coat. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I heard Connor laughing inside a loud, boisterous sound of a man who thought he'd just conquered the world. I walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching under my boots. I didn't go to Bernard's. I didn't go to the police. I got into my truck, drove to the edge of the property, and pulled over. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized. "Rachel?" I said when she picked up. He did it. He threw me out. He threatened me in front of a witness. And he admitted on tape that he's using the forgery to claim the jackpot. "Did you get the Sterling guy on tape too?" Rachel asked, her voice sharp and professional. "Every word," I said. "Good," Rachel said. "Now, Theodore, listen to me. This is the part where it gets hard. You have to stay away for 48 hours. Let him think he's won. Let him go to the lottery office in Salem on Monday morning. Let him present that forged ticket." "Why?" I asked. "Because," Rachel replied, "the moment he presents that ticket, he's not just committing fraud against you, he's committing a felony against the state of Oregon. And that's a bridge even a $1 million lawyer can't help him cross." I sat in the dark of my truck, watching the lights of my house, the house that was no longer mine. I saw the shadow of Connor through the window, pouring himself a celebratory drink. He had no idea. He thought he'd just evicted a broken old man. He didn't realize that I'd already begun the controlled demolition. But as I sat there, a thought occurred to me, a thought that made my blood run cold. "Rachel," I whispered, "if Connor tries to claim that ticket on Monday, what happens to Claire? She's the one who actually signed my name." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "That," Rachel said, "is the one variable we haven't accounted for. If he goes down, Theodore, he might take her with him. Are you prepared to let that happen?" I looked at the house one last time. The foundation was crumbling, and my daughter was still inside. What happened next changed the stakes from a game of money to a game of life and death. The night didn't bring any sleep. I spent it in a $20 a night motel on the edge of town, a place that smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under my weight, and stared at the grain of the wood on the cheap nightstand. As an engineer, I couldn't help but see the flaws, the way the veneer was peeling, the weak joints, the lack of care in the construction. It was a perfect metaphor for the life I'd allowed to be built around me for the last 8 years. I kept thinking about Rachel's question. "Are you prepared to let Claire go down?" That question felt like a structural crack in my heart. I'd spent 40 years protecting Claire. I'd held her through night terrors, paid for her nursing school, and stood silently by while she married a man I knew was wrong for her. I'd stayed quiet because I didn't want to lose her. And now, the very thing I'd done to protect her, giving her that ticket, had become the rope Connor was using to hang us both. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon on Sunday morning, I didn't feel refreshed. I felt like a bridge that had been carrying a load 10 times its capacity for too long. I was tired, but I was also focused. I got into my truck and drove back toward Ponderosa Lane. I knew Connor would be there, and I knew he'd be savoring his victory. I needed to see the damage for myself. As I turned onto my street, my heart sank. There was a large, orange dumpster sitting in my driveway. 2 men in neon vests were hauling things out of my front door and tossing them into the steel bin with a sickening metallic crash. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck, my boots hitting the gravel hard. "Hey, stop," I shouted. "What are you doing?" One of the men looked at me, bored. "Just doing our job, Pops." Homeowner called for a clean-out. "Everything goes." "I'm the homeowner," I roared, but as the words left my mouth, I saw Connor step onto the porch. He was wearing a new, expensive-looking cashmere sweater and holding a glass of orange juice. He looked like the lord of the manor. "Actually, Theodore," Connor called out, his voice smooth and mocking, "according to the emergency petition I filed yesterday, you're an interested party with restricted access. The court granted me temporary possession of the premises to ensure the safety and preservation of assets, seeing as you're currently displaced. I'm just helping you declutter." I watched as one of the men threw a box into the dumpster. It burst open on impact, spilling out a collection of old photo albums. One of them fell open to a picture of Mary Ann and me on our wedding day. The plastic sleeve crinkled as a heavy piece of lumber part of my old workbench from the garage landed on top of it. "You're throwing away her things," I whispered, the rage beginning to boil in my gut like molten lead. "I'm throwing away clutter," Connor corrected, walking down the steps toward me. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes scanning me with pure contempt. "Listen, Theodore, I'm feeling generous. I know you're a proud man. I'm willing to give you $50,000, cash, right now. You take it, you go find a nice condo in Portland, And you dropped this nonsense about the lottery ticket. You signed the final deed transfer voluntarily, and we forget the police ever had to be involved. $50,000. He was offering me a pittance of the $95 million he planned to steal, using my own home as a bargaining chip. "Where's Claire, Connor?" I asked, ignoring his offer. "Claire is resting," he said, his smile tightening. "She's had a very stressful few days thanks to your confusion. She agrees that this is the best way. She doesn't want to see you like this, Theo. Broken. Bitter. It's undignified." "You're a liar," I said. Connor's face transformed. The mock sympathy vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. He stepped into my personal space, lowering his voice so the workers wouldn't hear. "I'm the one with the winning ticket, old man. I'm the one with the law on my side. By tomorrow afternoon, I'll have the first installment of that money in a private account, and you'll be a ward of the state if you keep pushing me. Do you really want to spend your final years in a government-funded bed, eating lime jello through a straw? Because I will make that happen." He turned back to the workers. "Keep going. If it looks old or dusty, toss it." I stood there, paralyzed for a moment, watching my life being treated like landfill. I saw my engineering awards, my old drafting table, even the quilt Marianne had made for Claire when she moved to college, all of it headed for the dump. I didn't know it yet, but Connor had just made his biggest mistake. In his rush to humiliate me and declutter my life, he was throwing away things he hadn't even checked. I walked over to the dumpster, ignoring the workers, and reached in to grab a small battered leather satchel that had just been tossed on top of a pile of scrap wood. It was my old field bag, the one I'd used on project sites for 30 years. "Hey, get out of there," Connor yelled, moving toward me. "It's just my old work bag, Connor," I said, pulling it out. "Unless you want to sue me for taking a bag of dirt and old rulers?" He huffed, stopping at the edge of the driveway. "Take it and go. You have 10 minutes to clear out of my sight before I call the sheriff." I climbed back into my truck, the satchel heavy in my lap. I drove a block away, pulled over under the shade of a massive ponderosa pine, and opened the bag. My hands were shaking. I expected to find old blueprints or rusted calipers. Instead, I found a hidden compartment in the lining, something I'd forgotten I'd even used. Inside was a small plastic-wrapped bundle of papers. I pulled them out, and my breath hitched. They weren't mine. They were Connor's. He must have hidden them in my old bag months ago, thinking I'd never look through my junk in the garage. I started leafing through the documents. My engineering brain, trained to find patterns and structural weaknesses, went to work. They were gambling debts. Deep, dark, terrifying debts to a private lending group out of Reno. The numbers were staggering, nearly $2 million. There were also letters, threats, notices of final collection that were dated just 2 weeks ago. Connor wasn't just greedy. He was desperate. He owed money to people who didn't care about guardianship petitions or legal filings. He needed that $95 million not to build a life, but to save his own skin. But then, I saw something that made the blood drain from my face. It was a life insurance policy, a policy on me. It had been taken out 6 months ago. The beneficiary wasn't Claire, it was a shell company Connor had set up. The policy was for $5 million, and it had a specific clause for accidental death. The foundation wasn't just cracking, it was being rigged with explosives. I looked back toward my house. Connor was still standing on the porch, watching the workers destroy my memories. He didn't just want me in a home, he wanted me gone. If I went to a senior facility, the policy wouldn't pay out. But if I had an accident during my mental decline, what happened next changed the entire trajectory of the game. I was about to pull away and call Rachel when a black sedan with tinted windows turned onto Ponderosa Lane. It didn't go to my house. It pulled up directly behind my truck, blocking me in. 2 men got out. They weren't wearing neon vests, and they didn't look like junk haulers. They looked like the kind of men who handled final collections. One of them tapped on my window with a ringed finger. I rolled it down just an inch. "You Theodore Marsh?" the man asked. His voice was like sandpaper. "I am," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We're looking for your son-in-law, Connor. He isn't answering his burner phone. We heard he came into some money recently." "A lot of money." He leaned in closer, his eyes cold and predatory. "We figured since he lives in your house, you'd know where the ticket is. We'd like to keep this between us and the family, Theodore. We don't like involving the state. Makes things complicated." I looked at the house, then back at the man. I realized in that moment that I held the life of the man who had just evicted me in the palm of my hand. I could tell these men exactly where Connor was. I could let them take care of the problem for me. But then I thought of Claire. If these men went for Connor, they'd go through her to get to him. He's not there. I lied, my voice steady. He left for Salem this morning to claim the prize. If you want the money, you're looking in the wrong place. The man stared at me for a long beat, his eyes searching for a crack in my foundation. Finally, he nodded. Salem, Monday morning. Thanks, Theodore. You're a smart man. Stay smart. They got back in the sedan and tore off, heading toward the highway. I sat there, gasping for air. The stakes had just shifted again. It wasn't just about the house or the money anymore. It was about survival. Connor was heading into a trap on Monday, but he was walking into two different ones. He was walking into a prison cell if Rachel's plan worked, and he was walking into a death sentence if those men found him. And my daughter was right in the middle of the blast zone. I grabbed my phone and called Rachel. Change of plan, I said, my voice cracking. We can't wait until Monday. We need to get Claire out of that house tonight. Connor isn't just a thief, Rachel. He's a dead man walking, and he's going to take my daughter with him. Theodore, what happened? She asked. The wrecking ball is swinging, I said, looking at the orange dumpster in my driveway. And I'm the only one who can stop it. I didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous part of the bridge wasn't the span, it was the moment the old structure came down, and I was about to trigger the charges. I sat in the cab of my truck, the smell of old coffee and sawdust, my only companions, and watched the taillights of the black sedan vanish into the twilight. My breathing was ragged, a sharp contrast to the cold, analytical part of my brain that was already recalculating the load-bearing capacity of my life. I had reached rock bottom. I was a 72-year-old man, barred from my own home, watching my memories get dumped into a steel bin, with a literal bounty on my son-in-law's head and a life insurance policy on my own. Connor didn't just want my money, he wanted me in the ground. And the worst part, he was using my daughter as the shovel. I looked at the leather satchel in my lap. Those gambling debts and that insurance policy were the hidden truths that changed everything. Connor wasn't just a parasite, he was a desperate animal backed into a corner, and an animal in a corner is the most dangerous thing on earth. But he had made one fatal mistake. He assumed an engineer only knows how to build. He forgot that to build a bridge that lasts, you first have to understand exactly how to tear one down. I picked up my phone and called Rachel back. I'm not waiting for Monday, I told her, my voice vibrating with a cold, hard clarity. If he stays in that house with Claire tonight, I don't think she makes it to Monday. He's going to panic. Those debt collectors are already circling. Theodore, you can't go back there, Rachel warned. He has a guardianship petition. If you step foot on that property, he'll have you arrested. It'll play right into his mental instability narrative. I'm not going back as a victim, Rachel, I said, looking at the house on the hill. I'm going back as the man who knows where every structural weakness in that building is. I'm starting the reversal tonight. I waited until 2 in the morning. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across Ponderosa Lane. I parked my truck 3 blocks away and walked through the woods, the pine needles silencing my footsteps. I knew the perimeter of my land better than I knew the lines on my own palms. Connor had changed the locks on the front and back doors. I'd heard the locksmith's van earlier that evening, but he didn't know about the engineer's secret. When I built the house in '88, I'd installed a secondary utility access through the crawlspace for the radiant heating system. It was a tight squeeze, behind a loose stone in the foundation that Marianne and I had laughed about years ago. I pulled the stone away, the scent of damp earth and old concrete filling my lungs. I crawled through the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs, until I reached the floor hatch in the pantry. I moved it aside with a slow, agonizing, inch-by-inch precision and stepped into my kitchen. The house felt wrong. It felt violated. The air was stale with the smell of Connor's cheap cigars and the lingering scent of the trash haulers. I didn't stop to grieve. I moved like a ghost toward the guest wing. I found Claire in the room that used to be her nursery. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her bags packed, staring at the wall. When she saw me, she didn't scream. She just let out a small, broken gasp. Dad? How did you get in here? You have to leave. Connor. He's in a state. He's been drinking, pacing the living room with that ticket. Claire, listen to me, I whispered, sitting beside her. I took her hands. They were ice cold. I know why you forged my name. I know you were trying to stop him, but you need to see what he's really been doing. I pulled the bundle of papers from my satchel. I showed her the gambling debts. I showed her the life insurance policy. I watched her face as the realization hit her, the way her eyes glazed over, the way her breath hitched. $5 million? She whispered, her voice trembling. Accidental death? Dad, he told me this policy was for my future. He said it was a legacy plan he'd set up for the family. The only legacy he wants is a payout, Claire. He owes $2 million to people who don't take IOUs. Those men were at the end of the driveway tonight. They think he's going to Salem on Monday. They're going to be waiting for him. Claire looked at the door, terror finally replacing the numbness. He's been telling me that we're finally going to be happy, that we're going to move to Italy. He said, "You were the only thing holding us back." "I am holding him back," I said, "from destroying you. Now, you have to get out. Right now. Take your bags and go through the pantry hatch. Bernard is waiting at the edge of the woods. He'll take you to Rachel's." "What about you?" she asked, clutching my arm. "I'm staying," I said. "I have to be here for the final reversal. He needs to think I'm still the broken old man he evicted. If he doesn't see me as a threat, he'll walk right into the trap I've laid." "What trap?" I pulled the second winning ticket out of my wallet. I held it up in the dim light. Claire's jaw dropped. "He thinks he has the only one," I whispered. "He doesn't realize that the moment he tries to claim that forged ticket, I'll be standing right behind him with the original." "I didn't just buy a second ticket, Claire. I bought an insurance policy of my own, one that ensures he never gets a dime, and one that proves he tried to defraud me." I didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would determine if the bridge stood or if we all fell into the gorge. Claire left through the hatch, her eyes full of a daughter's love I hadn't seen in a decade. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but it was replaced by a cold, sharp tension. I was alone in the house with a man who had every reason to want me dead. I moved to the living room, staying in the shadows. I could hear Connor in the master bedroom, my bedroom. He was talking to someone on the phone, his voice loud and slurred. "I don't care about the collection window," he yelled. "I'll have the cash by noon Monday. Tell your boss to back off. I've got the ticket. It's signed. The old man is out. I've got him declared incompetent by tomorrow morning. He's a non-factor." He paused, listening. "Yeah, he's gone. I threw him out like the trash he is. Claire's sleeping. She's fine. She'll do what I tell her. She always does." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated loathing. He was talking about my daughter like she was a piece of furniture. He was talking about my wife's home like it was a pawn shop. I realized then that the revenge I wanted wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming the foundation. I wanted him to feel the exact moment the ground gave way. I wanted him to understand that you can't build a life on the wreckage of someone else's soul. I slipped out of the house the same way I came in. I didn't go back to the motel. I drove to a 2-4-hour diner in Salem, just a few miles from the lottery headquarters. I sat in a corner booth, drinking black coffee, and watched the clock. I spent the rest of the night with Rachel on the phone. We finalized the paperwork. We contacted the Oregon State Police Fraud Division. We gave them the recording of Connor's bribe attempt and the threats he'd made. We showed them the insurance policy and the gambling debts. "It's a slam dunk, Theodore," Rachel said, her voice sounding tired but triumphant. "The moment he presents that ticket, they'll have him for felony fraud, identity theft, and potentially attempted elder abuse. But there's one thing." "What?" I asked. "The men from Reno," she said. "If they're waiting for him at the lottery office, the police might not get to him first. It could get violent. You need to stay in the car until I give the signal." "I've spent my life making sure things are safe, Rachel," I said, looking at the first light of Monday morning hitting the horizon. "But some structures are so rotten they have to be demolished with a bang. I'll be there." Monday, 8:45 a.m. The Oregon Lottery headquarters in Salem is a nondescript building, but today it felt like a fortress. I sat in my truck in the far corner of the parking lot, my hat pulled low. At 8:55 a.m., Connor's SUV pulled into the lot. He hopped out, looking like $1 million literally. He was wearing a new suit, a gold watch, and a grin that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He didn't see me. He didn't see the black sedan with tinted windows parked 3 rows over, and he didn't see the 2 unmarked police cruisers tucked behind the landscaping. He walked toward the glass doors, clutching a briefcase like it was the Holy Grail. He looked like a man who had finally won. I felt the second ticket in my pocket. I felt the weight of 80 years of Marsh family history on my shoulders. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the empty cab of my truck. But the foundation wasn't just about the house. It was about the man who stands inside it. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. "Connor!" I shouted. He stopped, his hand on the door handle. Live. He turned around, his face shifting from confusion to a sneer. "Theodore, what the hell are you doing here? I told you to stay away. You want to be arrested for violating a court order on the best day of my life?" "I'm just here to make sure the math is right, Connor," I said, walking toward him, my heart steady, my pace measured. "The math is 95 million for me and 0 for you." He laughed, pulling the ticket out of his pocket and waving it at me. "See this? My name is as good as on it. You're done, old man. Go back to your motel. That ticket has my name on it, Connor," I said, stopping 10 feet away. "And we both know I didn't sign it." "Prove it," he dared, his eyes darting to the black sedan that was now slowly idling toward us. "By the time anyone cares, I'll be halfway to Europe." "I don't have to prove you forged it," I said, pulling my wallet out and revealing the identical second ticket. "I just have to prove that I own the other half. And since you're claiming a ticket that's currently under investigation for fraud, I think you'll find the payout is going to be a little delayed." Connor's face went white. He looked at my ticket, then back at his. You bought two?" "I'm an engineer, Connor," I said, the reversal finally clicking into place. "I always build a backup." That was the moment the black sedan accelerated. The doors flew open, and the two men from the night before stepped out. At the same time, the unmarked police cruisers surged forward, sirens screaming. Connor was caught in the middle of a collapsing structure. He looked at the mobsters, then at the police, then at me. What happened next changed the ending of the story forever, because as the police tackled Connor to the pavement, he screamed out a name that made my heart stop. "It wasn't me!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the glass doors of the lottery office. "Ask her! She's the one who wanted him gone." "She's the one who gave me the idea." I turned to look at the glass doors, expecting to see Claire. But it wasn't Claire standing there. It was Bernard. The world seemed to slow down, the frame rate of reality stuttering as the Oregon State Police officers drove Connor's face into the cold, damp asphalt of the parking lot. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut, a series of sharp metallic clicks, should have been the sound of victory, but it was drowned out by Connor's hysterical, jagged shriek. "Ask her! She's the one who wanted him gone. She's the one who gave me the idea." I didn't look back at the man I'd shared my home with for 8 years. I didn't care about his desperate attempts to shift the blame. My eyes were locked on the glass doors of the lottery headquarters. Standing there, silhouetted against the morning sun, was Bernard Sullivan, my best friend, my neighbor of 30 years, the man who had held the ladder while I repaired my roof and brought me bourbon when I buried my wife. But Bernard wasn't alone. Standing just behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, was a woman I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. She was older now, her blonde hair touched with gray, but the predatory sharpness of her gaze was unmistakable. It was Brenda Blake Connor's mother. I felt a coldness in my marrow that had nothing to do with the Oregon morning. I'd met Brenda exactly once, at the wedding. Marianne had pulled me aside that night and whispered, "Theodore, that woman doesn't look at people. She looks at balance sheets. Keep an eye on our daughter." I should have listened to her. I should have realized that the foundation of a man like Connor didn't come from nowhere. It was poured from a poisoned well. I walked toward the doors, my boots clicking on the pavement with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. The mobsters in the black sedan were being pulled out by the police, their hands behind their heads. But I didn't look at them either. I kept my eyes on Bernard. "Theodore," Bernard said as I reached the doors. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something shame, regret, in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here, old friend. You should have stayed in the truck like Rachel told you." "I build bridges, Bernard," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "I don't stay in trucks while they're being demolished." "What are you doing with her?" Brenda Blake stepped forward, a thin, mirthless smile on her lips. "He's being a businessman, Theodore, something you were always too principled to understand. You've been sitting on a gold mine for 30 years. That house, that land, that pension. And then you get handed $95 million. You're an old man who doesn't know how to spend it. We just thought it was time for a more efficient management of the Marsh estate." Everything clicked into place. The random suggestion to buy the lottery tickets. The way Bernard had always been there to witness my supposed confusion. The way he had encouraged me to let Connor and Claire move in. It wasn't a friendship. It was a long-term engineering project, and I was the site being cleared. "You tipped off the collectors, didn't you, Bernard?" I asked. "You knew Connor owed money in Reno. You knew if he felt the walls closing in, he'd act faster. You wanted him to forge my name. You wanted him to throw me out. You needed him to commit the crime so you could step in as the trusted friend and take control of the trust. Bernard sighed, looking out over the parking lot as Connor was hoisted into the back of a cruiser. Connor was always a weak link, Theodore. Desperate. Stupid. But he was the only way into your house. I told him about the life insurance. I told him about the guardianship. I figured he'd mess it up just enough for me to swoop in, save you from him, and then manage your affairs while you spent your final years comfortably quiet. And the lottery? I asked. A gift from the gods, Brenda interjected. The moment you bought those tickets, the plan went from a few $100,000 to $95 million. Bernard told me you'd buy too. He knew you were too meticulous to leave things to chance. We just had to make sure Connor grabbed the right one. I didn't know it yet, but the smart protagonist they thought they were outplaying had been 3 steps ahead since the moment Dave the clerk had showed me that security footage. I looked at Bernard, and for the first time in 30 years, I didn't see a friend. I saw a structural flaw. You're right about one thing, Bernard, I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out my phone. I am meticulous. I hit a button on the screen. A loud, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the speakers inside the lottery office. At the same time, the glass doors hissed shut and locked. What is this? Brenda snapped, pulling at the handle. It's a security lockdown, I said. I called Rachel an hour ago. She's not just an estate lawyer, Bernard. She's a former clerk for the state attorney general. She spent the night filing an emergency injunction based on the evidence I found in my old field bag. But I added a little engineering of my own. I pointed to the camera mounted above the door. This building is state property. You're currently being recorded on a secure government line, admitting to a conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft. And Bernard, I didn't just record Connor last night. I recorded you 2 weeks ago. Bernard's face went gray. What are you talking about? The night we played chess, I said. The night you suggested I buy the tickets. You forgot that I have a smart home security system. I just installed it because I was worried about my memory. You and Maureen were in my kitchen while I was in the workshop. You talked about the debt collectors. You talked about how Connor was primed to take the bait. I didn't say anything then because I wanted to see how deep the rot went. I stepped back from the doors as Rachel pulled into the lot, followed by a black SUV with FBI on the side. You think you're so smart because you know how to manipulate people, I said to Bernard, who was now pounding on the glass as the agents approached. But you forgot the most basic rule of engineering. Never assume the foundation is asleep just because it's quiet. The next hour was a blur of blue and red lights. The mobsters were taken into custody, turns out. They were also being looked for in 3 other states. Connor was headed for a high-security cell, facing a litany of felony charges. And Bernard and Brenda? They were being escorted out of the lottery office in zip ties, their business plan reduced to a pile of evidence in a federal prosecutor's folder. But I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like a bridge that had finally been decommissioned. I felt old. I felt empty. I sat on the bumper of my truck, watching the sunrise properly now. Rachel came over and sat beside me, handing me a bottle of water. You did it, Theodore, she said. The injunction is permanent. The lottery board has already flagged both tickets. Once the criminal cases are settled, the prize will be released to you, and only you. Connor's claim is void. Bernard's claim to your guardianship is dead. And Claire? I asked, my voice cracking. Rachel looked at me gently. She's at my house. She's safe. But Theodore, she's going to need a lot of help. She's been living in a house of mirrors for a decade. She doesn't even know who she is without Connor's lies. I looked at the house I'd built on Ponderosa Lane, or where it was, 20 miles away. I thought about the orange dumpster. I thought about the photo of Mary Ann under the scrap wood. The house is gone, Rachel, I said. Not the walls, but the home. I can't go back there. What happened next changed everything, Rachel said, echoing my own thoughts. You don't have to go back. You have $47 million after taxes. You can build anything you want. You're an engineer, remember? I stood up, the joints in my knees popping. I looked at the second winning ticket, still tucked in my wallet. It was just a piece of paper. The real prize was the silence in my head, the absence of Connor's mocking voice and Bernard's false friendship. I didn't know it yet, I said, but the hardest part of the project wasn't the build, it was the cleanup. I spent the next 48 hours in a fog of legal meetings and police statements. I saw Claire once. We didn't talk much. She just sat in Rachel's guest room, wrapped in a blanket, looking like a ghost. I didn't press her. I knew the weight of the debris she was under, but on the third day, something happened that I didn't expect. I was at the motel, packing my few remaining belongings, when there was a knock on the door. I expected Rachel or a detective. Instead, it was Maureen Sullivan, Bernard's wife. She looked like she hadn't slept in years. Her eyes were sunken, her skin sallow. She didn't try to come in. She just stood there holding a small weathered wooden box. "Theodore," she said, her voice a thin reed. I didn't know what he was doing. Not all of it, I thought. I thought he was just trying to help you get your affairs in order. He told me you were slipping. He told me we had to protect you from Connor. I didn't say a word. I'd heard enough lies to last 3 lifetimes. He asked me to get rid of this, she said, handing me the box. A year ago, he told me it was junk from your garage that was making you depressed. I couldn't do it. I knew what it was. I took the box. It was heavy, made of solid cherry wood. I recognized it immediately. It was the box Marianne had kept on her vanity, her secret archive. "Why are you giving this to me now, Maureen?" "Because," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I saw the news. I saw what they were doing, and I realized that if I don't give this to you, the foundation really is gone. There's something inside, Theodore, something Bernard didn't want you to find, something that explains why he was so desperate to get you out of that house." She turned and walked away before I could ask her anything else. I sat on the motel bed and opened the box. Inside were letters, old, yellowed letters from the late 80s. They were from the previous owner of the land on Ponderosa Lane. I started to read, and my heart stopped. The house I'd built, the home I'd loved, the foundation I'd trusted for 36 years. It was built on a lie that Bernard had been protecting for 3 decades. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my life, and the woman I'd built it with. The motel room was silent, save for the rhythmic, lonely hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread, the cherry wood box resting heavy on my knees. It smelled of Marianne lavender and the faint, sweet scent of the beeswax polish she used once a month. My hands, which had survived decades of sub-zero bridge inspections and heavy masonry, were finally shaking so hard I had to set the box on the nightstand to open it. Inside were the letters, not from a stranger but from my wife. I'd spent 36 years believing I was the protector, the engineer who kept our world stable, but as I unfolded the yellowed stationery from 1990, I realized I'd been living in a structure designed by someone far more strategic than I could ever be. The letters weren't love notes to Bernard, as a darker corner of my mind had momentarily feared. They were legal warnings. It turned out Bernard Sullivan hadn't just been our neighbor. In the late 80s, when we were buying the land on Ponderosa Lane, Bernard had been the surveyor for the county. He'd discovered a clerical error, a massive one. The original parcel we'd bought was actually twice the size we'd paid for, including a hidden strip of land that extended toward the river, which was now worth millions in development rights. Bernard had tried to blackmail Marianne. He told her he'd hold up our construction permits and tie us up in court for years unless she signed over half the property to him in a silent partnership. He'd bet on her being a simple housewife who would be intimidated by his county authority. He had bet wrong. Marianne hadn't told me. She'd known I was already under enough pressure building the high desert bridge, and she didn't want my pure engineering heart, as she called it, to be tainted by the filth of a greedy man. Instead, she'd done her own research. She'd found evidence of Bernard skimming off the top of municipal contracts. She'd kept the records. She'd countered his blackmail with a dead man's switch. The letters in the box were copies of the agreement she'd forced Bernard to sign in 1991. It was a total relinquishment of any claim to our land, coupled with a confession of his own fraud. She told him that as long as he stayed a good neighbor and never breathed a word to me, the evidence would stay in that cherry box. But if he ever moved against us, or if he tried to harm our family's peace, the box would go to the district attorney. Maureen had known. She'd spent 30 years watching her husband pretend to be my best friend, knowing he was only staying close to keep an eye on the woman who held his life in her hands. When Marianne died, Bernard thought the threat died with her. He'd spent the last 8 years slowly manipulating Connor, stoking the boy's greed, waiting for the right moment to finally reclaim the debt he thought the world owed him. The lottery ticket wasn't the catalyst of our downfall. It was the wrecking ball that Bernard thought would finally smash the last of Marianne's protection. He didn't know she'd trusted Maureen to keep the box if he ever turned sour. I didn't go to the police right away. I didn't call Rachel. I sat there until the sun was high in the sky, realizing that the foundation of my life wasn't the concrete I'd poured, but the fierce, silent love of the woman who had walked beside me. She'd been the one holding the bridge together while I was busy looking at the sky. I met Rachel that afternoon at a small park overlooking the Deschutes River. I handed her the cherry box. "This is the final piece," I said. "This is why Bernard did it. It wasn't just about $95 million. It was about 30 years of resentment. He felt like he was a king living in the shadow of a man he couldn't break." Rachel read through the documents, her face going pale. "Theodore, this changes everything for the criminal case. This proves premeditation going back decades. Bernard isn't just a conspirator, he's the architect of the whole thing. Connor was just his tool." "I want the fund set up," I said, looking at the water. "The Marsh Foundation. I want $20 million to go toward legal aid for seniors. I want $5 million set aside for a trust for Claire, but with one condition." "What's that?" "She has to finish her nursing recertification. She has to work for 2 years on her own, without a cent from me. I want her to find her own bedrock." Rachel nodded, her eyes soft. "And the house, Theodore? The dumpster is gone. The house is empty." "Sell it," I said. "Every stick of furniture, every inch of land. I don't want to live in a monument to a lie." "Marianne isn't in those walls, Rachel. She's right here." I tapped my chest. A month later, I stood on the deck of a small, modern cottage on the coast at Cannon Beach. The air was salty and sharp, the kind of air that clears your lungs and your head. I'd bought the place with a fraction of the winnings. It wasn't a mansion. It was a 2-bedroom house with a massive window facing the Pacific. There was a knock on the door. It was Claire. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, she wasn't wearing makeup, and she was dressed in scrubs. She'd been working at a clinic in Portland, living in a small studio apartment. She hadn't asked me for $1. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice sounding steadier than I'd heard it in years. "Hi, honey, come in. The tea is almost ready." We sat on the deck watching the waves crash against Haystack Rock. The silence between us was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of Ponderosa Lane. It was a working silence, the kind you have between two people who are slowly, carefully, rebuilding a bridge. "I saw the news about Connor," she said, her voice low. 20 years. And Bernard. They're saying he might not ever get out. Considering the fraud charges from the 90s they've reopened. He built his own prison, Claire, long before the police got involved. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "I almost let them destroy you." I was so caught up in my own fear, I didn't see what was happening to the man who gave me everything. "You were a secondary structure under too much load, Claire," I said, the engineer in me finally speaking the truth. "No bridge can stand when the pylons are being actively sabotaged. I don't blame the bridge for collapsing. I blame the man who cut the cables." I reached over and took her hand. "But the thing about bridges is, once the site is cleared, you can build something even stronger. You just have to make sure the footings are deep this time." "I'm going to earn that trust, Dad," she said. "Not the money, the trust." "I know you will," I smiled. "In fact, I'm counting on it." I didn't know it yet, but the satisfying revenge I'd sought wasn't found in Connor's cell or Bernard's downfall. It was found in the quiet moments on that deck. It was found in the letters from Marianne that told me I was a man worth protecting. I'm 72 years old, and I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But my true wealth is the knowledge that I stood my ground. I reclaimed my name. I saved my daughter from a predator. And I learned that even the strongest man needs a foundation built on more than just stone and steel. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Pacific in shades of fire and gold, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since 2016. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was a man who had survived the storm and come out the other side with his integrity intact. If you're listening to this, and you feel like the walls are closing in, if you feel like the people you love are eroding your life, remember the story of Theodore Marsh. Don't let them tell you that you're old or confused. Don't let them treat your life like a decluttering project. Stand on your bedrock, find your evidence, and remember, you are the engineer of your own destiny. The bridge is open. And for the first time in a long time, the crossing is clear. A home is not the walls that surround you, but the truths that support you. Greed can steal your money, and manipulation can steal your peace, but only you can surrender your foundation. Build your life on honesty, and even the strongest storm will find you unshakable.